session where we are going to be discussing Ameet's book on performance and the political power and pleasure in contemporary Kerala. I was requested by Ameet to chair the session, and he also kind of prodded me and said you should also make an intervention because our colleague Vishnupriya Dutt, who was supposed to speak here, sadly cannot be with us because she lost her mother. And her mother was indeed a very tiring political figure in the theatre in Bengal, Shobha Sen, and she passed away. So I certainly will not double for Vishnupriya, but I will take a little more time. Where does one begin? This book for me is an achievement and something I'm very, very proud of, very happy this book has been written. I found it very dense and very theoretically sophisticated, and at the same time very, very grounded in a kind of historiography of Kerala performance culture that I personally have not encountered before. Maybe all of you from Kerala know these figures. Very, very important revolutionary political figures. And so for me this was a real opening. It was really very, very exciting. But perhaps the most exciting thing about this book is that, with no apologies whatsoever, this book, I think, engages with the political through the lens, language, and discourse of performance studies. And I would like to stress with no apologies, because performance studies, which is all what we are a part of, is a very, very, very young discipline in the Indian context, especially if you want to link it with its global kinds of ancillaries. And there are always kinds of, there's a certain kind of condescension towards performance, which you mention in your opening paragraph. Performance is something peripheral, maybe it will help you, it's interesting, it has limited efficacy, etc., etc. And I think what I like about the book is that without, in any way dithering about the importance and the viability of performance studies, that Ameet goes just straight for it. And he's in a very, I would say, confident kind of way, and in a very easy kind of way. So I thank you for writing the book, Ameet, because it is a contribution to the field. And this is something that I think will be remembered. I would say there are two primary interventions in this book, theoretically, which all the panelists will be picking up on. It's a very general point I'm making. One is an intervention in relation to the regional. Okay? Now, we all know the regional plays a very important part in our culture and our understanding of culture, but it's a very fraught category. And we know that the regional has been hegemonized. It's kind of subsuming all kinds of marginal cultures, all kinds of minor cultures in the Deleuzean sense. So it's become a hegemonic category in some level, but we can't do without it. And yet we fall prey constantly to this kind of the way in which it is being hegemonized. Earlier, we know, of course, the state has used the regional for its tedious yet relentless reiterations of the celebration of diversity. And so you find this very clearly and graphically represented in the Republic Day Parade, etc. And we know that the regional also gets reiterated through the official agencies, the cultural agencies of the state, like the Sangeet Natak Academy, through rather spineless but very powerful constructions like theatre of roots. Okay? And now, Ameet is only too well about all of these things, and he indicates them, but he doesn't unnecessarily polemicize this, because this is an over-reiterated, in some ways, critique. I think he's trying to figure out the regional differently. And here he does not take, let's say, a very classic social scientist approach to understanding the regional via, let's say, G. Aloysius's Conceptualizing the Region, which is a very, very valuable book. We all teach it. Rather, he turns to his colleagues, Bose and Varughese's earlier book, and their theorization of the regional. And I'd just like to read out the 3 points which are important in this reading of the regional. One, understanding of the region is not completely determined by the nation and by the mechanisms of the nation state. So giving the region a certain kind of autonomy, a certain kind of dissident kind of independence. 2, region is not a pre-given discursive, homogeneous and inert domain, but internally multiple and constantly re-territorialized. I would personally go along with this premise, especially the fact that it's not pre-given, it's internally multiple. I'm not so sure about the constantly and re-territorialized, because I'm a bit of a realist, and I feel that on the one hand there may be a problem when you fix the region, but there may also be a problem if the region becomes so mutant and it's always mutating that you can't really get a handle on it. And I think it's always going to run up against borders and boundaries and other kinds of disciplinary measures. And the third reading of the regional here is that it contributes to global modernity. I like that, because all too often the regional is seen as some kind of the backwaters of the state, and it's the state that has the prerogative, the onus to, in a sense, define modernity, claim modernity, which is not the case. Modernity can emerge from many different kinds of locations as such. And I think that Ameet succeeds in doing this theoretically. And he does this theoretically by achieving something quite rare, which is to give you very dense descriptions of very local, micro-regional performances, the kind that would never enter standard theater history books. And he's able to braid this and link this with the cultural theory and philosophy of figures like Gandon, like Mladen Dolar, whom I've never read before, who has this extraordinary theory around the excess of voice, which I'll get into, and of course important figures in performance studies like Nicholas Ridout in Passionate Amateurs and Una Chowdhury on Zoesis. And there's a very interesting, there's a certain kind of ease with which he is able to bring these very, very local performances under recitals, etc., and braid it with these larger, in a sense, global theories. The second intervention, of course, is at the level of the political. I grew up in Calcutta, and my understanding of the political in relation to theatre has, of course, been largely influenced by that location, and also by the fact that I had the extraordinary privilege to see some amazing theatre, political, revolutionary, and all kinds of theatre between 1972 to 1977. Which are roughly the dates that correspond to a lot of what you're talking about. And I also had the misfortune of seeing a lot of very bad theatre after 1977, when the left-run government came into power, and this extraordinary theatre seemed to collapse almost overnight. So I know this period only too well. Let me just say that reading in this book about Kadamanta, Ramakrishnan, Sambashivan, Babies, Nadu Galika, Shankar Pillai, whom I knew a little bit of, Aziz's plays, and the work of the CPIML Cultural Organization, Bailey, that I was absolutely thrilled by this reading of the political. I was excited. And what had become for me a somewhat moribund category within the framework of performance in the Bengali context suddenly was seething alive for me, very contemporary, maybe the 70s for me, very, very contemporary. And I found, why is it contemporary? What excited me? It's volatile, it's unpredictable, it's dangerous, and it's not working within the paradigms of reason. And I suddenly realized, I'm reading this kind of stuff, my God, is Bengali theatre so entrapped within the kind of protocols of reason? I know maybe that's not an adequate category, but I just felt a certain kind of freedom in my own way of imagining the political on encountering this kind of stuff here. Now, he's very clever here because he does not reiterate the trajectories of the political that have now become consolidated in the writing of political theatre in India. And thank God, there's no Ikta in the book. So every time you have got Ikta, you know, it's like this, no, I know Ikta, it's huge. But my problem is when Ikta becomes a kind of indispensable reference point for redefining everything political. And I feel, okay, we have to historicize it, it's hugely important, there are connections with it, but let's not go on and on about it. So there's no Ikta in this book, and it would be interesting, did Ikta have a role to play in Kerala as such? One would have to question that. The only inscription is that of Navamna. And Navamna comes up once in the entire book in the context of hunger, and how hunger gets evoked differently in the context of this extraordinary play, Navamna, and Nadugadika. It's a different kind of rendering of hunger. So that's the only inscription. Along with Ikta, of course, there's the other honorary Bengali called Bertolt Brecht. And inevitably, Bertolt Brecht will always be there. And I have a love-hate relationship with Bertolt Brecht. I'm close to him. But thank God, no Bertolt Brecht. You know, there's just one inscription of Bertolt Brecht in the chapter on gesture. And here again, he says very clearly, instead of the Brechtian gestures, what Sambharshivam is also positing is an affective excess that needs to be seen differently. He moves between the presentational and representational without even registering the boundary as problematic. So, alienation effect, etc., etc. It's working. Gesture does not always have to be interpreted through a Brechtian lens. So, I think so. He doesn't reiterate those kinds of those trajectories. So, how then does he theorize the political? This is the key question. And I would say it's through an engagement with tropes, with different kinds of theoretical tropes that embody a kind of what I would call performative materiality. So I'm going to just give you 3 clusters of tropes, and that's all I'm going to do here. I think that the other panelists might flesh them out. Affect is one of the key words in this book, affect. And it's interesting, he doesn't draw his theorization of affect from someone, let's say, like Brian Masoumi, but oddly enough, he gets this from, I'm trying to get my, from Ben Anderson, who in an unusual citation of a source I don't know, says, affect is the limit to power because it is limitless. Okay, so he works with affect. With affect, there's excess, surplus, letting go, waste. That's one cluster. So he's seeing the political not in terms of being contained, but let go, you know, excess, you know, going beyond. Okay, that's one cluster. The second cluster I got was my keyword, passion. So passion keeps coming up over and over again in the book. Passion, pleasure, the senses, the sensory, and of course, very linked to the body. So the body is given a huge amount of importance, and it's very, very vividly described in different performances. And the third cluster for me would be something like the ordinary, the parodic, I would add the grotesque, which you don't theorize, and failure. Now, when you take these 3 clusters, this is a constellation of constructs, okay? And it is through this constellation of constructs that he tries to, in a sense, say something about the political in relation to performance. Structurally, this is not, he does not give us a synoptic perspective on performance in the political in contemporary Kerala. It's a schematic treatment. So we have 5 chapters, and then 5, once again, let's call them motives. So you have vision, voice, gesture, machinic, animal. Not becoming animal, just animal. I had a problem with machinic, and we can talk about that later. For me, it read more like Sonic, you know, and I felt the machinic needed more of an engagement with labor, which wasn't there, but maybe we can talk about that later. Anyway, these are the 5 chapters which are very kind of related to very quick descriptions of specific performances and events. I won't go into that. And then there's an introduction and there's a postscript. And both the introduction and the postscript, which are fantastically written, I think, are grounded in the urgency and the extremity of specific political moments. So, book begins with emergency. And then he is really a real master of that period. I hope one day he will read a full book on that, you know, historiography of that moment. So he's dealing with political authoritarianism of the emergency and the way the propaganda machine of the state worked through different kinds of affects. But interestingly, and this is a point open to debate maybe from political economists, that with state authoritarianism, what he does is to have what he calls a prefiguring of the neoliberal economy. Now, generally the neoliberal economy is something that we tend to push a little later, but he sees it as a prefiguring. And of course, in the postscript, what you have is the authoritarianism of the present, very much in JNU, because it's set in JNU, so he brings it absolutely down to this moment here in JNU, and where the authoritarianism needs no, in what has been called the state of undeclared emergency. And if the neoliberal kind of inscription was sort of lurking somewhere, well, neoliberalism is in your face now. Okay? And it's in your face through the mediatization of our culture and what he calls the instantaneity of all the kind of, well, images around the national itself, by which many of us will be deemed anti-national. So that's the kind of framing of the book, and I found that very telling. There is no, I would say, sustained argument in the book, but there are threads of arguments. And I will only pick up on one thread, and it concerns the politics of affect. I'm sure there are other things to talk about. The politics of affect, and I'm going to throw out a question, which for me is a real question. What are the limits of the politics of affect? You know, what are the limits? And here I think I'm interested that while affect is given a lot of weight, there's absolutely no kind of engagement with the obvious antonym, if you will, or complementary word, effect. So there's no real reading of effect, effectivity, effectiveness, efficacy, which are the key words that John Mackenzie, for example, highlights in his reading of performance as techno-science. And I realize you couldn't go in that direction because that's not the material you're dealing with, but there's also James Thompson, for example, who's a very important figure in the area of applied theatre, who's done this work in Sri Lanka, where just briefly he did a workshop with child soldiers, and he went home to England, and 3 months later, 23 of those children were slaughtered. Okay? And that event triggered off a kind of reflection on a book he wrote called Performance Affects. But I've always been troubled by the effect part, which seems to be kind of missing. Now, very, very categorically at one point, Ameet says, the political emerges under the condition where one is simultaneously caught in something on which she or he does not exercise any agency, and yet in which she or he is actively or indeed passionately invested. So on the one hand, there seems to be a correlation being made between absence of agency and passionate investment. And I said, yes, and what? Where do you go with that, you know? And I have to say he takes on that question very, very categorically in the postscript, where he asks us to, you know, really question who is affected, who is charged up today, who has got a passion today. It's the right. It's the right who are, in a sense, the passionate, what do we call them? Let's leave that a blank. And he poses this very, very provocative kind of statement, and it addresses each and every one of us in the room. How does one make sense of the poise and rational dissent, the protest and argumentation of the people critiquing the actions of the state and of the virulent pro-nationals vis-a-vis affective categories like passion. Has the politics of affect undergone an inversion here, where the nationalists are now caught in the affective politics, while the people engaged in political critique of the state and its official nationalism have become rational? So have we become rational? And in becoming rational, are we getting anywhere? Or are we, in a sense, working against some kind of wall? So how do we negotiate this moment? Do we recognize the limits of reason? Do we simply parody the passion of the extremist right and risk provocations? Or do we reinvent our own modalities of passion? And if we reinvent our own modalities of passion, what are the sources for that? I will not go into that here, and just go to the last paragraph and end. This is the paragraph. The question of the political does not emanate from the text or the performance alone. That's a bit of a paradox given the fact that it is grounded in performance. Nor does it reside in any pre-given community or public. Okay? It's interesting, he doesn't mention the word party. So the party, how do we position party in relation to, affect, fashion, politics, etc.? Indeed, it is in the moments when the already given and the assumed meanings of performance fail that performance opens up the political as a new condition of the present. It is here, at the in-between space between the performance and its spectators, that the political community ephemerally comes into being. Now this could be said, I would say, for almost any performance. All performances work in this interstice of the performance and the spectator, and communities, ephemeral communities come into being. But I think what is the crucial word here for me is fail. So he's opening up the politics of failure, which is a very difficult thing to do, and I don't think the left has found it very easy to acknowledge failure. Failure is painful. So it's much easier to live in denial of failure, but I think when you live in denial of failure, what are the risks? Nostalgia for something that was very rich, denialism of a certain kind, and a certain smugness saying, oh yeah, we've already arrived. So how do you engage with this kind of failure? How do we actually engage with that extraordinary injunction made by the greatest, I would say, spokesman of failure in the dramatic world, Samuel Beckett, who said, fail again, but fail better. It's an extraordinarily ironic thing to say, fail better. I remember in this statement an echo of a conversation I had with one of Kerala's leading modernist writers, O.V. Vijay, whom I had the honor to meet just once. And I think it was his Parkinson's that he had, or he had some kind of, he was trembling all the time, he was just trembling. And his voice was trembling, and he was shivering. But in that trembling and that shivering, he uttered these two words I will always remember for the rest of my life, and he said, positive failure. I know those words affected me a lot, and they still affect me, but I'm still trying to figure out what it will mean. And how does one actually, what do we do about positive failure in terms of mobilizing the political now, in this moment? So these are some of the thoughts that I had on the book, and I would now like to invite